Thank you, Molly. Our next speaker, David Kaiser, is a historian, college professor, and author, and he was one of Bill's most devoted friends. David also participated enthusiastically with Bill in his crusade to reduce the financial burden on today's college students. As it turns out, a few days before Bill passed away, we began to hear about the changing tuition policies at a number of the major universities that Bill had lobbied so persistently. As a result, many students will find college much more affordable. David Kaiser.
I first met Bill Strauss on a June afternoon in 1994 at our 25th reunion at Harvard. Although I had already read and taught his first book on the Vietnam era draft, Chance and Circumstance, I did not recognize him as the author. Merely as an interesting guy who talked about recent history with a vocabulary all his own, with a somewhat frightening certainty, but in a way that seemed to make a lot of sense. It was about a year or two later that I picked Generations off the shelf of my school library and started to read it, and for most of that week I was too excited to sleep. A few days later I called Bill, reintroduced myself, and said that I thought he had gotten the boundaries of the GI generation off, he and Neil. We started talking about that, and that thus began a very long and intense friendship. Bill Strauss was a dear friend of mine, and together with Neil Howe, a truly great historian. I too could talk a lot about the time I spent with Bill and his family. That became really a second home. About the campaign we were involved in against Harvard, and about our many points of agreement and disagreement. But I'd like to talk about his work as a historian, which I think reveals parts of him which other things did not. In the books Generations and The Fourth Turning, Bill and Neil literally rediscovered America and opened our eyes to new ways of seeing the world. That was an extraordinary achievement. There is no one, literally no one, in my own generation from whom I have learned as much as I did from them. Meanwhile, they were revealing a great deal about themselves. Now, their work focuses on four archetypes, four different kinds of people or generations, which they saw recurring through history. They called them prophets, nomads, heroes, and artists, and there are some of all four here today. As Bill explained to me, they believe that we all have each of the archetypes within us, but the era of our birth determines which one will predominate. What strikes me as I think about Bill today is how he indeed showed the characteristics of all four in different ways and in different parts of his life. That isn't surprising. He and Neil could hardly have seen them all so clearly if they had not seen them in themselves. Generation X represents the nomad type of generation, and Neil and Bill were among the first to identify and understand Generation X. Bill had nomadic tendencies of his own. He worked for himself, often by himself, and when and how and on what he wanted. There were also some nomadic or Gen X elements in his early life history, and like so many Gen Xers, he reacted to them in his own life by an absolute and total devotion and commitment to his own family. Bill was also reserved in many ways, and he was not really, in many ways, an easy man to know. Bill's life also showed some of the heroic aspects that we identify with the GI generation and today's millennials, who became, in a way, his great love, too. He counted on the millennial generation to undo so much of what he disliked about contemporary society. Meanwhile, over the last 8 years of his life, after his diagnosis, he acted the part of a hero. He refused, sometimes, I must say, to the frustration of some of his friends, to make any concessions to his disease, even when he was obviously running considerable risks. He was determined to go on being Bill Strauss up to the very end, and that is exactly what he did. The tremendous organization he put together in Cappies also represented that kind of archetype. And Bill could even be, like the silent generation, now the older generation, something of an empathetic artist. Certainly that's what he was in the early days of the Fourth Turning website that he and Neil founded in the late 90s when he was a regular participant. Incidentally, I've been asked to announce that there will be a gathering of some of the posters on that website after the reception here at the King Street Blues at about 6. If you're interested, try to find Jenny Genscher, a.k.a. the One Cat, at the reception. In those days on the website, Bill emerged as a person of extraordinary politeness who treated every opinion equally and wanted everyone to feel at home. In addition, despite his often uncompromising moral views, I was one of those who found, in the midst of a personal crisis of my own, that Bill could be extremely understanding towards a friend in trouble. Many of us, I think, found in crisis that his bark could be a lot worse than his bite. But above all, Bill was a prophet in every sense of the word. It is thanks to Bill and Neil that I've come to understand both the strengths and weaknesses of my own prophet generation, the baby boomers. Like those very first two prophets, Adam and Eve, we decided at a very early age that we would make our own judgments about good and evil. We take life and ourselves very seriously. We tend to believe that whatever we want must be best, not only for ourselves, but for anyone else involved. We want our lives to have a definite purpose. Each one of us believes in our own uniqueness, and frankly, we don't mind being the center of attention. And above all, perhaps, we have an unshakable, scary confidence in our own wisdom. All of this, and America and the world has now come to learn this the hard way, makes us utterly disastrous when we happen to be wrong, and utterly invaluable if we happen to be right. Bill and I had our disagreements, but Bill was right much, much more often than he was wrong. That, I think, in a very profound sense, is why we are all here today. I have never known anyone with a more unique set of views than Bill Strauss. He made up his mind quickly, especially about people, and he rarely changed it. He was in many ways an eccentric, but one who often believed that that was the fault of the rest of the world. Certain contemporaries, in particular, became the objects of his wrath, and his emotions sometimes prevailed over his brain, certainly another characteristic of prophets. Thus, I was proud to be associated with Bill in our campaign against the payment of multi-million-dollar bonuses at Harvard, and I shared his view that income of, say, over $3 million a year ought to be taxed at 100%. Yet I will also remember one of our very last conversations, surveying the political scene early last December, when he expressed great excitement over Barack Obama and what he stood for, but when he also commented that if the election turned out to be between Hillary Clinton and Mike Huckabee, he would have to vote for Huckabee. Well, that was Bill. Yet his most distinguishing characteristic, and this really showed up in the books he wrote with Neil, was repeated flashes of astonishing insight, the kind of insight that enabled them to uncover the 80-year pattern in American history that is now, once again, coming to a climax. He and Neil were amateur historians in the literal sense. They did what they did out of love. But perhaps because they were amateurs, they had the courage, some might say the audacity, to believe that they could rewrite American history based on what was really a fairly quick survey of biographical and other secondary literature. They made that work by seeing into the heart of things. Their work is so unique that I still wonder how widely it will ever become known. I am very proud to be one of only 2 professional historians who have seriously engaged it in print, and it has made my own books better. But like many other great writers of the past, they will always be there for those curious enough to find them. One of the great gifts which Bill and Neil gave to those of us who have read those books is the ability to identify ourselves in members of parallel generations from the past. That also, as I've discovered, makes their ideas a marvelous teaching tool, and starting in 2 weeks, a group of my students at the Naval War College will be learning about their ideas in a course called Generations in Film for the 10th year in a row. To illustrate that point, and to conclude this talk, I'm going to use the words of a fellow prophet from an earlier generation, from the missionary generation, the great historian, journalist, and civil rights activist, W.E.B. Du Bois. He and Bill actually have quite a bit in common. Du Bois was born in 1868. putting his life in exactly the same relation to the Civil War as Bill's was to the Second World War. Du Bois also earned undergraduate and graduate degrees at Harvard, and he too lived a life of varied pursuits and was, among other things, a great historian. Du Bois was lucky. He remained alert and active well into his 90s, and he died in August of 1963 at the age of 95, astonishingly, literally on the very eve of the Great March on Washington, an event which, I am very proud to note, was attended, along with tens of thousands of others, by two 16-year-olds named David Kaiser and Bill Strauss. Du Bois spoke the words I am about to read at a celebration of his 70th birthday in 1938, by another coincidence, exactly 70 years ago. As you hear them, I don't think you will have any trouble understanding why I decided they would be fitting words to end my commemoration of the sadly shorter life of my dear friend and his fellow prophet, Bill Strauss. Here's what he said. I have been favored among the majority of men in never being compelled to earn my bread and butter by doing work that was uninteresting, or which I did not enjoy, or of the sort in which I did not find my greatest life interest. This rendered me so content in my vocation that I seldom thought about salary or haggled over it. I insist that regardless of income, work worthwhile which one wants to do as compared with highly paid drudgery is exactly the difference between heaven and hell. I am especially glad of the divine gift of laughter. It has made the world human and lovable despite all its pain and wrong. I am glad that the partial Puritanism of my upbringing has never made me afraid of life. I have lived completely, testing every normal appetite, feasting on sunset, sea, and hill, and enjoying wine, women, and song. I have seen the face of beauty from the Grand Canyon to the Great Wall of China, from the Alps to Lake Baikal, from the African bush to the Venus of Milo. Perhaps above all, I am proud of a straightforward clearness of reason, in part a gift of the gods, but also, to no little degree, due to scientific training and inner discipline. By means of this, I have met life face to face, I have loved a fight, and I have realized that love is God and work is his prophet, that his ministers are age and death. This makes it the more incomprehensible for me to see persons quite panic-stricken at the approach of their 30th birthday and prepared for dissolution at 40. Few of my friends have openly celebrated their 50th birthdays, and near none their 60th. Of course, one sees some reasons. The disappointment at meager accomplishment, which all of us to some extent share, the haunting shadow of possible decline, the fear of death. I have been fortunate in having health and wise in keeping it. I have never shared what seems to me the essentially childish desire to live forever. Life has its pain and evil, its bitter disappointments, but I like a good novel, and in healthful length of days, there is infinite joy in seeing the world, the most interesting of continued stories, unfold, even though one misses the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David.